Hi, I'm indie author Melinda Kucsera. Welcome back to my podcast where I am reading chapters from my book, Curse Breaker Enchanted. Sorry for the long hiatus. They've been doing construction on the apartment next to mine for months now, and that seems to have come to an end, or they're ending it before I get home from work because it's actually quiet enough to record again. So I'm hopeful that they're finished and that there won't be any more interruptions. It's great to be back, and I hope you're all excited because today we are diving into part 2 of Curse Breaker Enchanted. But first, I need to thank our patron because I am so grateful for their support. Thank you, Glenda, Andre. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Thank you so much for your support. And now, I bring you part 2 of Curse Breaker Enchanted. Today I'm going to read the first chapter of that. And then I'll talk a little bit about that chapter as I've been doing with previous segments of this podcast. And also give you an update on what books I'm writing right now, what the release schedule is looking like, which is always subject to change because working with fictional characters is sort of difficult. They're very temperamental, they have their own ideas about things, and those ideas do not always jive well with deadlines or anything that I have planned, or outlines in general. They have great difficulty following outlines. So we'll talk about that at the end. Part 2, Haunted. Haunted by the ghost of a dead child, Sarn searches for clues to the boy's death against the orders of his superiors. The mystery only pulls Sarn deeper into trouble, exposing him and his young son, who's determined to help him, to supernatural dangers not even magic can thwart. A soul is a terrible thing to waste, but Sarn's shields don't work against creatures that don't have a body. His first crack at investigating magical problems might very well be his last, and his son's too. Chapter 20. Orange-robed men stalked through the enchanted forest, and it ignored them as they prowled. They sought magic to destroy. Sarn fled, but they followed. I must go somewhere and do something. Inside him, a restless white fire rattled its cage in quiet rage. What do you want me to do? I must get away from those seekers. They'll kill me if they catch me. Sarn skidded to a halt as those orange-robed fanatics melted into a river of ichor. Black waves surged as he turned and fled. Through the trees flashing by, he caught glimpses of hikers. A boy turned, and his pale green eyes met Sarn's, freezing him in place. The viscous black liquid flowed around his ankles, screaming for his blood as it sunk claws into his flesh. But the boy held him hostage with a glance. I can't fix you. His words from last night replayed, and their horrible truths slammed into Sarn, knocking him down into the receding ichor. The earth groaned and rained dirt and corpses on him. Sarn rolled and scrabbled for a handhold as the ground sloped into a ravine, and the dead boy tumbled into it. His pale eyes begged for help. Darkness fountained out of that chasm in a frigid torrent. It clawed at the sky, scratching until it tore a hole in the shimmering fabric underlying all, unleashing a swarm of cockroaches. Every tree they bit darkened and turned on Sarn as he climbed out of the ravine. Branches sliced through the air, missing him by a hair's breadth as he twisted and tumbled. A million bees droned, Im Mire Eritor, until he stuffed his fingers into his ears to block it out. Broken circles gleamed and hovered in the air, sketched by a different type of magic. They sought to trap him, but Sarn evaded them, and glowing gossamer threads followed him. More circles appeared, some floated, and others extruded from the ground. Sarn veered around one set, rising in his path, and skidded to a halt as the enchanted forest divided. She waited at the other end of a sylvan gauntlet, the queen of all trees. Her light extended silver hands to him in welcome. Come, deeper into the magic's thrall, she seemed to say. No, I've gone too far already. Sarn woke with a start and scanned his immediate surroundings for threats. 2 icons glowed, his son asleep in his arms, and his brother moving about the cave. A third icon stained his map. It was so dark, he almost missed it when that feeling of impending doom crashed over him. Rand stirred, but Sarn held the little scamp still while he sussed out the threat. What did I sense? His son poked him, but Sarn didn't react. The third icon was small and moving. He almost had a lock on it. Rand giggled and poked a sore spot this time, making Sarn wince, and he lost the watcher. Rand froze, but Sarn's chest muffled his apology. I know you're awake. Myron threw something, a book maybe, onto the floor. Sarn glared at his brother. What's with the tantrum? Are you 4 or 14 today? Rand opened his mouth to add his observation, but Sarn covered it. I got this. You wash up for breakfast, okay? His assurance earned him a nod, and a much too compliant child gained his feet. Sarn accompanied him, still searching for the third entity in their room. Could it be the ghost boy? His head map hadn't included that specter before. Why would it start now? I'm still waiting for an answer. Sarn scanned his cave. Nothing looked out of place, but something was watching them, and it raised his hackles. Are you mad at me or your schoolwork? Myron glanced at Sarn as he passed within punching range. He didn't swing at him, but Myron gripped the book tightly in his hands as he stoked his anger, building it up to an explosion. But why? Do you want to go fishing? I'll get a Sunday off and we'll go, just the 3 of us. After yesterday, they owe me, and I owe you. You do so much for me, and I do so little to repay you, damn the Rangers. Sarn clenched his fists. Myron stood there, with his mouth hanging open for a moment longer before his entire manner changed. You mean it? But you hate fishing. Sarn suppressed a shudder at the thought of gutting and eating fish. But you enjoy it, so we'll go as soon as I can wrangle a day off. And swimming? Rand bounced up and down, smiling when Sarn nodded. Yes, we'll go swimming, and maybe my brother will teach you a new stroke. Myron nodded, pleased with the plan. Sure, I can show him the backstroke or the breaststroke. Myron's eyes narrowed as he ran through the list of swim strokes he knew. Anything to make him a strong swimmer, you decide. Sarn still hadn't found that elusive watcher. Damn it, nor spotted the remains of last night's dinner. Not even a single empty jar. Maybe I'm losing my mind. That would explain everything that had happened yesterday. The watcher and the feeling of impending doom that was increasing every moment he stood there. Did you already have breakfast? Yeah, I ate the last of the stew and the peaches. They weren't bad cold. Sorry, but there wasn't enough left to share. Myron shrugged. There might be a piece of flatbread left, but it tastes like sawdust. Myron had left Sarn with a dilemma. Go back to his not-so-secret stash or trek upstairs for breakfast. Rand gave the white crumbs dotting the table a longing glance. Upstairs won, since stolen food required no preparation, and the walk might shake loose and overlook fact or reveal their spy. But up there came with its own set of dangers. We'll be quick and careful. Sorry, Myron said as he limped to the door, rucksack and crutch in hand. Sarn waved off the apology. Not your fault there wasn't enough for us all. We'll get something upstairs. And then I'll get some answers. Myron nodded and headed out for class. Since his brother refrained from slamming the door, his mood must have improved. Now, I just need to wrangle a Sunday off to keep him happy. Nola will just love that. Sarn rubbed the bridge of his nose, where the beginnings of a headache prodded him. We get breakfast to go on an adventure now? Rand bobbed up and down because the boy already knew the answer was yes. Sarn regarded his son. Rand's clothes looked clean enough, but his clothes weren't. Later, when his son wasn't looking, he'd take care of that. Bad enough Rand could see the scar marring the left side of his face. Breakfast first, then we'll see. Sarn swirled his cloak around his shoulders and kept an eye out for the watcher. It would be easier to protect his son if they were on the move. Put your cloak and boots on. I'll tie them for you. Rand scampered off to find both articles while Sarn pulled his boots on and tied them. After picking up the books and papers discarded during Myron's tantrum, he stepped through a floating cold spot. His skin prickled, and he shivered. Sarn set the pile on the table and scanned the cave for the source of that cold. Was it connected to the Watcher? Sarn's magic flared, and his eyes blazed, eradicating the shadows. What the hell is watching us? Not something from the mundane side of things, which meant it most likely had something to do with the murders and the general insanity of yesterday. Rand paused as he stuffed his sock-covered foot into a boot. He threw a curious glance at Sarn, but Sarn just shook his head. In the last 36 hours, he'd stumbled across multiple homicides, been kidnapped, stalked by a ghost, chased by trees and mud creatures, and witnessed too many odd happenings. And he still didn't understand why. It was time to change that. Sarn consulted his mental map, seeking the route freest of pedestrians since his son's safety hinged on secrecy. If he kept a firm mental grip on his goal, his magic would bend his path to reach it, leaving him free to watch for spies and other dangers. His son's hand was so small, yet it extended a trust bigger than them both. Does the ghost trust me to investigate its death? That would explain why it kept appearing, but not its strange behavior. Sarn set the mystery aside for now and concentrated on his back trail. There! A barely perceptible icon followed them on his map. As they turned a corner, Sarn held a finger to his lips and signaled for silence. Rand's eyes widened, and he nodded. The tunnel was empty, just as his map had predicted. Sarn scooped up his son, rushed up the wall, and crouched on a shield-shaped rock formation. With his eyes squeezed closed and his cloak wrapped tightly around them, they should be invisible. Below, the spy paused. Lift the hem of my cloak slowly and look down, but don't make a sound, Sarn whispered into his son's ear. Mystified, Rand nodded, dropped to his belly, and crawled until he could peer over the edge. Sarn gripped the back of his son's tunic, but stayed focused on their watcher. When it continued down the tunnel, he reeled his son back in. What did you see? A rat, I think, but I'm not sure. It's dark down there. Rand's face screwed up in a grimace. Sarn nodded and cursed the weak light cast by the strip of Lumiere crystals 20 feet overhead, which barely lit anything. He rolled off the rock formation and landed in a crouch. When his son tried to copy him, Sarn shot to his feet and caught the boy. No tumbling for him, not here where there were lots of sharp rocks. Sarn set his son down. Best if he kept his hands free in case grappling became necessary. At least a mile ahead, a man-shaped icon flared up on his map, but it wasn't the usual amber of the non-magical kind. This man was a middling gray, and the rat headed straight for him. Interesting. Walk as quietly as you can. Sarn held out his hand to his son. Rand took it, eager for that adventure. Are we sneaking up on someone? Sarn nodded and motioned for silence. Maybe skulking around counted as a father-son outing. Sarn hoped so, as he followed the rat away from the warren comprising the heart of the lower quarters. Other rats scattered as they passed piles of refuse, but none of them rated a mention on his map. There was something off about the one they followed, something unnatural. The word bounced around Sarn's skull as he ducked behind a stalagmite. What did you see? He asked his son, wishing his damned eyes didn't glow so he could look for himself. A gray cloak and rats around it. They're sitting on here, too. Rand tapped Sarn's shoulders. It's floating. What's floating? The cloak. Sarn took a moment to figure out what his son meant. A person stood with his back to Rand, leaving nothing but his cloak visible. Not helpful. What is he doing with the rats? Talking to them. Can you hear what he's saying? Rand shook his head and curled into him. They're coming. Sarn hugged his son tight, shielding him as a horde of rats climbed his body and leapt off the top of his head onto the stalactite above. After they disappeared, Sarn pushed to his feet, still holding his son, and swept the tunnel with both his magic and his eyes. The rat man and his spies had also vanished. Damn. Moldering banners billowed like giant wings in the cool breeze as someone whispered that phrase again. Empire Eredren. Why do I keep hearing that phrase? What does it mean? Sarn scanned the tunnel, seeking its source, until a hammer struck a chunk of metal, startling him. Sarn jumped, and so did his son, but he shook his head when Rand opened his mouth to ask a question. Between the blacksmith below and the hammering of his heart, Sarn couldn't hear anything as he steered his son around a metal grate in the floor. Did you hear anything before the hammering started? Sarn asked when they'd put some distance between them and the underground smithies. Rand shook his head. I'm hungry. You promised breakfast, then an adventure. Yeah, I did. Let's find some stairs and get you fed. When Sarn turned to make good on that promise, he stared at a dead end. How many turns had they taken? Finding the rat man had distracted him. Steam puffed out of another grate, and Ran backed away to avoid being cooked. "Where are we?" He turned curious eyes on Sarn. Beyond the rising clouds of steam, a pile of rubble blocked part of an unfamiliar intersection. "Where the hell are we?" Sarn shook his head and called his map, but it resisted his summons. What was wrong with his map? Its betrayal rocked Sarn, and he fetched up against a wall, startling his son, whose hand he still held. "Are you okay?" Sarn blinked at the question. Was he? "I don't know." On his third try, his map finally spawned, but it displayed only featureless darkness ahead. They'd followed the rat right off his mental map with no warning. A shudder cut through Sarn. How is that even possible? I've wandered all over the lower quarters over the last 6 years. I've lived here. Except for this one spot, but how could he have missed it? A green arrow blinked as it appeared on his featureless map, demanding he head deeper into unknown territory. Where the hell is my map leading us? Curiosity warred with unease. Down here, the unfamiliar could be deadly, but so could retreating. Sarn chewed the inside of his cheek. Rand tugged his hand and pointed. "That's a bad thing." Sarn slashed his hand through the indicated spot, and cold bit his skin, numbing his fingers on contact. Was it unexpected? Yes. But dangerous? No. "It's cold air. It won't harm you. Come on." Sarn tugged his son's hand, but Rand refused to budge. "A natural!" whispered his magic as Sarn's stomach heaved. He swallowed bile as the cold spot dissipated. Rand glanced around, brow creasing in confusion as the boy chopped his hands through the air. "It's gone! Where did that cold thing go?" "I don't know, and I don't care. I just want to find the staircase and get off this level." The upper levels were grids, unlike this twisty warren, but they had their own dangers. Rand nodded, but he checked again before taking a single step, and Sarn did the same. His son was too precious to risk. Unexplored tunnels invited trouble, and he needed to avoid dangerous situations right now. "Where are we going now?" Rand formed a bright pinpoint in the darkness covering this section of his map, and his tiny flame wanted breakfast. Thoughts of his son made Sarn's magic flare around him in a blinding spear. He struggled to suppress it, but too much magic surrounded him, and Sarn had too small a place to hide it away, so he was stuck, with emerald ribbons circling them and nuzzling his son. Rand giggled at his magic's attention. What would I do without that sunny child? With such ominous thoughts in mind, Sarn grasped his map, desperate to make it respond to his commands. When he pulled back on the distance, his map zoomed out and confirmed they were still inside the mountain. Something tugged on his map, centering it on a Y intersection a mile back where they should have turned right instead of left. A quarter-mile beyond it, a staircase corked through the mountain, and a long-tailed icon scampered up it, the Watcher. Sarn smiled. At least something had gone right. His magic still had a tenuous fix on the spy. Hopefully, it would rendezvous with the Rat Man again. If we hurry, I could get a fix on the spy master himself and find out why he's tailing us. A tug on his pants directed his attention to his son, whom he still owed breakfast. "Is the middle kitchen okay with you?" Sarn said, preempting his son's question. Rand nodded as he caught the boy's hand and hurried towards answers and food. Having a destination relieved Sarn, though the holes in his map still bothered him. They existed too close to his cave. He must explore them, especially if the Rat Man and his spies called them home. But not now. Sarn added them to the growing list of questions he needed to answer before time ran out. Fate only knew how long he had and which questions were relevant. Rand looked from the ladder masquerading as a staircase to Sarn. "Does this go up to food?" His eyes pleaded for the answer to be no. "Yeah, they all do." Sarn patted his son on the head. "You can reach every level I know from any stair, including this one." Of course, they'd make a brief stop on the next level for a chat with the flickering gray man-shaped icon. With luck, it was the Rat Man. On his map, the stairwells all looked corkscrewed into place by giant hands, but none of the stories Sarn had ever heard had mentioned the average height of the Litharians who built this place. He wouldn't be surprised to find out they were giants in their day. "Oh, okay." Rand shrugged and climbed toward the promise of breakfast. "Will they have sausages? I like the red ones." "You mean the ones with dried tomatoes in them?" "Yes, I like them." "They might. If I see them, I'll grab some." "Get 2 for me." Rand licked his lips in anticipation. "I don't know. 2 might be too much for you," Sarn said. Rand nodded and continued climbing. His enthusiasm for sausages propelled him until his foot broke through the rotting wood. No more! Rand clung to Sarn's legs. His son had been brave to make it this far. Here, climb on my back. I'll find us a better staircase. Sarn crouched down, and his son climbed on without a word. Hold tight, okay? As Sarn finished speaking, his foot broke through the step, but it struck stone underneath. Magic shot up his calf, anchoring him in place. Sarn cursed and willed his magic to let go. After a brief struggle, he finally freed his boot, but Sarn overbalanced and banged his shoulder into the wall. Thank fate, the pain faded as he climbed. He'd take every reprieve life offered. Sarn stepped onto a reassuring stone platform at the top of the stairs and set his grateful son down. 5 feet onward, a portal led to a tunnel and the level above the lower quarters. He didn't sense anyone except a rat creeping around, but Sarn pulled his hood down to cover his face anyway before peering into the narrow corridor beyond. Rand copied him, and his hooded head poked out around Sarn's leg to do his own people check. Sarn looked down at his son, who, as if cued, glanced up at him with a look of such concentration, Sarn laughed. He patted his son on the head, and Rand grinned, pleased with his performance. Before venturing into the realm of the non-indentured, Sarn bent to deliver his usual warning. If anyone comes... Rand rolled his eyes and nodded. I know. I hide until he goes away or you tell me to come out. I'm not a baby. No, you're not. All right, let's go. On alert for trouble, they stepped out into a Lumiere crystal-lit tunnel and stayed low as they wound around the stacks of crates. Since Sarn had never had a reason to visit this level until now, his magic sketched in the details as they skulked around, making his head itch. Sarn tried the doors they passed, but they were all locked. Any goods kept under lock and key must be valuable, and he always needed things to trade in the lower quarter's thriving black market. Sarn patted down his pockets, but found nothing to pick or force those locks. He cursed his ill luck and starred this place on his map for later. Too bad Myron isn't here. He could have read the words stenciled on the boxes. Oh well, another time perhaps. Sarn pressed on, scanning the numeric sequences stamped on every parcel and committed them to memory. They weren't random. There was a pattern to them. The mystery teased his imagination, but he had more pressing mysteries in need of solving. If only I had a crowbar. Before he came within eye shot of the man shape on his map, Sarn crouched behind a short wall of rolled-up rugs. Rand tapped his shoulder. What are you doing? Checking something. But I'm hungry. Rand rubbed his belly, reminding Sarn of the purpose of their outing. I know. I'll make it quick. Stay here and be quiet. Rand's eyes widened, but he nodded and stayed put. As Sarn crept around the pile, he extended his hand and his magic toward that cloaked figure. His fingers closed on the gray fabric covering it, and he flung it aside. Who are you, and why are you spying on me? She had no face, just a blank spot where her nose and mouth should be. But her eyes, oh fate, they were flat discs, reflecting his glowing eyes and the slice of his scarred face visible beneath his hood. What the hell are you? Sarn dropped her cloak and backed away. She dissolved into a sea of scurrying rats, but her eyes remained. They laughed at him. Then they, too, vanished. Rand screamed and startled Sarn into action. He spun and rushed to his son as hundreds of rats raced toward the terrified boy, but the rats just ran past him. As soon as he reached his son, Sarn pulled Rand into a tight hug and rubbed his back. I'm so sorry. I got carried away. We'll get breakfast now. No more rats. Rand clung to Sarn and balled his fists in his tunic. As Sarn nodded, his magic circled them, alert for long-tailed spies. Green tendrils curled around his son, hugging him too, and his son finally relaxed. I'll keep them away from you. So would his magic. Rand nodded and rubbed tears from his eyes, but Sarn didn't put him down. After giving the crates to his left one last glance, Sarn poked his gift, but his magical senses declined to penetrate the wood. His magic focused on protecting his son, and Rand needed its reassuring touch more than he needed to know what was inside those boxes. Stymied, Sarn let the mystery go for now, until the number 13 caught his eye and drew him to a box, 1 foot on a side. Rand lifted his head from where he'd nestled it in his shoulder. His little face was puffy from crying, but his eyes brightened with curiosity when Sarn set the boy down so he could get a better look. The parcel was half hidden behind 2 stacks of odd-shaped bundles with a pair of wings inked on its side. As Sarn traced the image, a skull and crossbones symbol interrupted his vision. His magic recoiled, knocking Sarn away from the parcel, and he cursed. "What is it?" Rand touched his leg. "Drugs," Sarn said finally, his lips twisting in disgust. "It's allele, or angel's dust, judging by the sign stenciled on the side, which made it Shade's hallucinogen of choice." Sarn kicked the offending box. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Rand dart behind a pile of crates. Sarn turned too late to see what had just spooked his son. A man slammed Sarn into a wall, and an elbow the size of his knee jammed into his throat. "Why didn't my magic warn me?" His attacker was in his mid-30s with bad teeth and a waistline rivaling the columns supporting the 30-foot ceiling. He squashed Sarn, pinning one arm behind his back and the other against the crate tower hiding Rand, but the stupid fool had left his lower half free. When he caught his son's eye, Sarn shook his head. He could fight this oaf without help, but his magic disagreed. It strained to touch the wall, and so did his hand because his magic had seized control of it. Sarn clenched his fist, but his cloak was caught between his hand and the stone wall calling to him, so there was no way he could touch it. "What the hell happened to Beku? I heard she's dead," the big man asked. "Who are you?" Sarn kneed the jerk in the groin. The big man crumpled, and Sarn stepped over the groaning heap. "Be glad I didn't headbutt you. At least you're still conscious." "You're a rank bastard, Sarn," the big man bit out. "How the hell does this creep know my name? Who is this guy, and why does he have a grudge against me? I had nothing to do with her disappearance." "And the son of a whore, I know." Sarn turned in time to avoid a flying fist aimed at his head. He seized the newcomer's wrist, twisted it behind the man's back, and caught the wiry fellow in a joint lock, the same one Grigori had used on him. "You'll dislocate my arm if you keep pulling on it." "Thanks for the suggestion." Sarn increased the pressure, eliciting a high-pitched scream from his prisoner. "What the hell do you want?" Footsteps warned Sarn, and he mule-kicked whoever had snuck up behind him. His foot collided with flab, not muscle, and the odds of winning this fight ticked upward. His would-be attacker groaned as his body thudded to the ground. I must have hit a sensitive spot. Sarn had a pretty good idea what, and he winced as he turned to check. Sarn kept the cowed man between him and the two approaching men. They all looked to be in their 40s and late 30s. As they glared at him, hatred darkened their eyes, and they clenched their fists. Why did they hate him? Sarn towered over his attackers, giving him reach. Add in a 1 to 2 decade age difference, and he had speed on his side too. But not mass. His attackers outweighed him by a lot. Thankfully, he had a captive, the guy he'd put in an arm lock, and he kept that man between him and the 3 approaching men. "What the hell do you want?" The trio exchanged glances as they chose a spokesman, a man with gray streaking his beard and hair. Sarn tagged him as Gray on his mental map, which had become transparent for the fight, but he could still see the markings on it. Gray frowned as his brooding eyes fixed on Sarn, the object of his ire. "We heard about Beku's death." "Who are you?" Sarn stared at Gray. Why did she matter to them? She'd vanished back in early March. "We know you had something to do with it," said a hooked-nosed lout with a cowlick as he too glared at Sarn. "And we're here to make sure you pay for it." Muscled arms wrapped around one of Sarn's ankles and twisted. Damn it, he'd forgotten about the guy he'd kicked in the nuts. Sarn shoved his prisoner at the hook-nosed pugilist, rushing toward him, but now his free captive stumbled over the crawler's body and crashed down, freeing his ankle. Sarn dodged a right cross from Gray and crashed into a crate. The wooden box didn't even slide when Sarn leaned back, turning his fall into a roll. He threw his feet over his head and planted them on the ground behind the crate. Being ridiculously tall and flexible had its advantages, and it brought Sarn a moment to come up with a plan. Unfortunately, nothing came to mind. He was outnumbered and probably outmatched. Sarn popped up, crate in hand, and bashed a man with bad teeth on the head as the guy rounded a pallet of boxes. Nails rained onto the floor as the man he'd hit folded. Well, that explained why the crate was so heavy. Sarn threw the rapidly emptying crate at another man while it still had some heft, and dodged a vicious kick aimed at his kidneys from another man, half hidden by a pile of barrels. These men knew this area well, allowing them to come at Sarn from all angles. I need to put some distance between me and them, but how? Sarn collided with a waist-high pile of sacks and sat down hard on them, kicking up a cloud of potato flour, but it wasn't enough to obscure anyone's vision, just enough to make everyone sneeze as that cloud spread out. Sarn sneezed as he tried to get clear of that flower, so his eyes would stop burning and tearing and blurring his vision. Thank fate, his map pointed out the fist flying at him in time to throw himself out of the way. Eyes still tearing, Sarn hit the ground and rolled to his feet. He blinked to clear his eyes as he seized another crate and lifted it like an awkward shield. A large man, possibly the same man he'd hit in the groin, buried a fist in the crate, and the crunch of wood drowned out the snapping of bones. The man screamed and writhed as he tried to free his hand from Sarn's makeshift shield. Small metal balls rained onto the floor from a fist-sized hole in the crate and rolled around. Sarn backed away from those trip hazards and pushed a heavy barrel between himself and a man missing both of his front teeth. The fool kicked the barrel and screamed as it belched black powder in his face. The powder smelled like metal and sulfur, an odd combination. I wonder what that is. A metal ball whizzed over Sarn's shoulder, distracting him from that powder, and it ricocheted off Gray's collarbone. Where did that projectile come from? Sarn glanced around for the source, and his son darted out of cover to grab something, then disappeared behind a wall of crates. Sarn realized what his son was doing and cursed. His map took that as an order and indicated his son's current position, less than 10 feet from him. Sarn dove behind a tower of boxes and caught the thieving boy. I need you to run away and stay out of sight. But I'm helping, and we're winning. Rand held up the slingshot, so that's how he'd hit Gray with that metal ball. Where are you, boy? The voice came from the opposite side of the crate tower. Sarn jumped in front of his son, and Rand ducked behind a wine cask. The metal ball in his son's hand glinted in the light of the Lumiere crystal as Rand vanished into the shadows. At least the boy was following orders now. Sarn waited for another 10 count before toppling the tower of crates nearest the voice. A muffled groan signaled he'd hit his target. Maybe Rand's right. Maybe we are winning. More projectiles sailed past as Sarn knocked over several barrels, but they weren't aimed at him. The more obstacles he threw into his attacker's path, the better. Maybe they'd buy him enough time to escape with his son. A shape shimmered into existence, and Sarn stared at the ghost boy. What was he doing here? The ghost copied Rand and lobbed handfuls of metal balls at the men until he ran out. Then he kicked the sack, sending plumes of flour into the air. Sarn backed away from the flour and rubbed his eyes, but the specter remained. No one even reacted to it except him. Am I hallucinating his help? The ghost tossed a door handle at a skinny man, and it struck the man's knee, stopping his charge. The fellow went down clutching his injured leg, and the sight proved the ghost was real and helping, even though that was impossible. A leather strap wrapped around Sarn's throat and choked him. He cursed his inattention as he struggled to free himself. He hadn't even noticed the man was sneaking up on him from behind. I got him! The speaker dragged Sarn into a cleared space. As the noose tightened, Sarn scrambled for a hold on the leather, but a hand fisted the strap right behind the buckle, digging it into the nape of his neck. Sarn tried to work his fingers under the belt, but they slipped off its smooth surface. He threw his stronger leg back and mule-kicked his attacker. A grunt and a curse indicated his blow had landed, but not where Sarn had hoped. He missed the guy's nuts and probably struck his stomach or thigh. Damn it. He wouldn't get another shot. The belt tightened again, choking off his air supply, and Sarn gasped, desperate for air. Were they trying to kill him or teach him a lesson? Sarn scoured their faces for answers, but they gave nothing away, not even their intentions. When a board slammed into the backs of his knees, they bent, but Sarn remained suspended by the strap alone until the arm holding it lowered. His knees hit the cold floor, followed by his belly and chin. Magic shot out to cushion his fall, but it slid off the belt. Something about it defeated even his magic's nimble fingers. That was another mystery, but he already had too many to solve. A weight settled on top of Sarn, flattening him, and that ended his speculations. Dinner plate-sized knees landed on either side of his lean hips. Great, the man he'd struck in the nuts now sat on his back. Without let going the strap, his attacker jerked Sarn's left arm behind his back. Someone else wrenched his right arm back and bound his wrists together. His magic poked at the bindings. Pick it apart, Sarn told it as he struggled, but hands seized his ankles and bound them too. That's too good for you. Hot breath stirred the hair on the back of his neck. Sarn went white with horror and thrashed as he gasped for air. The noose contracted again, and his vision swam. Ease off. We don't want to kill him. Just incapacitate him. Do you know how much they'll pay for someone like him? A hand flipped Sarn's cowl back and jerked his head up. Look at those eyes, like a pair of emeralds in the sun. Gray shook his head. They're more vivid than any on sale in the flesh market. Sarn blinked away an awful vision of them plucking out his glowing eyes and selling them on the black market. Is that where we're taking him? Asked one of Gray's friends. Gray let go of Sarn. Oh no, he's worth his weight in gold to the right buyer. Because of his funny eyes? No, because of his age. Most boys like him never reach adulthood. You're going to make us a fortune. It won't bring Beku back, but your suffering will ease her raging spirit. Gray patted the back of Sarn's head, and his magic locked on. Fix acquired! His magic chirped as Gray's icon changed to one Sarn could follow anywhere. The stupid fool had signed his death warrant. Now to get out of the whole being sold into slavery thing again. Last time he was 12 and unprepared. This time he had magic and a son with nimble fingers. The belt contracted again, reminding Sarn he wasn't in control of the situation yet. Free me! Sarn waited for his magic to comply, but it wasn't paying any attention to him anymore. I asked you a question. Answer it and you might earn some leniency. Who knows how long you'll be our prisoner before we find a buyer for you. Gray fisted his hand in Sarn's hair again and jerked his head up. What question? Sarn choked out as the belt loosened enough for him to draw in more than a sip of air. How did she die? I don't know. It was the truth, but not the answer they wanted to hear. Leather creaked as the belt tightened again. Sarn's lungs sobbed for air. Black spots danced before his eyes, swelling with each passing second. Just a little more, and there. His pants tore, and both his bare knees pressed into the ground. He wished his magic worked on the bindings instead, but he'd just have to work around them. A connection sparked between Sarn and the mountain, but Sarn ignored it as he sent his magic searching for his son and found a rat instead. Why was Ratwoman interested in this? Figure that out later. Find your son before you black out and leave him unprotected. Sarn sent his magic out again, seeking that one bright pinpoint in his dimming awareness. I must keep Rand safe. Nothing else mattered right now. Eventually, these fools would lock Sarn up somewhere and he'd escape. But Rand must stay safe and out of sight until then. And that was a tall order given his son's inquisitiveness. Magic spread out in concentric rings, plunging his awareness deep into the mountain's roots instead of fanning out across the ground toward his son. No! Sarn fought it, but his magic refused to obey him. A cancerous tumor gnawed at Mount Eredren somewhere nearby, and his magic sped toward it. But Sarn was adrift in a world that was fast fading to gray. Im Meyer Eredar, whispered a voice in his head. Unclean! Shrieked his magic as it recoiled from the cancer and awakened something. Mount Eredren stirred, then it roared. Sarn clung to consciousness by a suffocating thread, and it frayed as the mountain juddered, and the noose tightened. Gray's questions had become an insistent buzz in his ears, interrupted by the thunder of breaking rocks. Where were the rocks he distantly sensed falling? Please, not near my son. Sarn met the ghost boy's startled eyes as an invisible force tore at the ghost's garments. Rand shouted something. No, son, run away. Hide until it's safe to come out. Sarn wanted to search for his son, but he couldn't look away from the flickering ghost child. The ground heaved, and Sarn's world faded to black as an image of a 13-pointed star burned in his mind's eye. I've seen you somewhere before, haven't I? The question pursued Sarn into darkness. Time had finally run out for him. Stop it! Rand darted in front of Sarn and fired his slingshot, striking the man holding the belt right between his eyes. Let go of my papa! As the big man toppled, the belt loosened. Magic flooded Sarn, pulling him back from the edge of unconsciousness. His map tried to form, but Sarn banished it with a thought. He didn't need it right now. Thankfully, Mount Eredren had calmed and stopped quaking. His son stood unprotected between him and Gray. Then the boy disappeared. Before Sarn could wonder where he'd gone, a small D dug into his side. Metal balls clinked in Rand's pockets as his nimble fingers slid the belt through the buckle, loosening the makeshift noose. Sarn dragged in a grateful lungful of air as the magic receded from his chest, and he flirted with unconsciousness again for a moment. Breathe, Papa! Rand patted the back of his head. Sarn attempted a nod, then gave up when white fire shook its cage somewhere inside him. It wanted to break out. Not again. Sarn had neither the wherewithal nor the inclination to deal with two types of magic right now. One had already plugged into the mountain. If Sarn lost control of the other, he didn't know what it would do. Rand? I'm here. Rand patted Sarn's shoulder, then walked around until he came into view. I'm okay. Are you okay? Sarn nodded. He rolled onto his side, breaking his connection to the mountain, and stopped the flow of information to his inner cartographer. He also shoved his map out of sight when it tried to manifest. Now really wasn't the time to view its progress mapping this area. Annoyed at the interruption to its map editing session, his magic poked brilliant green fingers at the bindings at his wrists and ankles. Finally, his magic had decided to do what he'd wanted it to do all along. Sarn suppressed his annoyance. He was just glad the bindings were made from some natural fibers, so the knots fell apart with a little help from his son. Free, but too damn tired to move, Sarn pillowed his head on his arm and just lay there, catching his breath. Behind him, he sensed Mount Eredren settling back into its interrupted slumber. Sarn made sure no bearskin touched the stonework, so the mountain stayed asleep. One brush against his mind was scary enough. Rand leaned into Sarn, and his magic spun a protective emerald bubble around them. "Who is this boy, and why does he call you Papa?" asked one of his attackers. "Because he's my Papa." Rand squared his shoulders and turned to face the men. "I'll admit, you're the spitting image of him, but how could you be his son? You're too old." Gray bent as he considered the boy. Rand returned that scrutiny with interest. "Am not. He's my Papa." Rand folded his arms over his chest and glared at Gray. "All right, little mouse, how old are you?" "4." Rand held up 4 fingers and wiggled them. "And I'm not a mouse." All the men laughed at that. "You look too old to be 4. The large man Sarn had kneed in a sensitive spot commented. The guy still had one hand cupped around his groin. "Because I'll be 5 soon. I'll be fine on March. Rand trailed off, unable to recall his birthday. He glanced at his father for the answer. 15th, Sarn supplied, remembering the day his world had changed forever. "Look, kid, I don't know what he's told you, but you can't be his get. He's not old enough to be your father." "He is my son." Sarn rose, but dizziness forced him to plant his rear and wait. Perhaps his son was right. Adventures should take place after breakfast, and fights too. Since all the men's attention had riveted on his pint-sized savior, and his magic had the boy well protected, Sarn could rest for another minute. "Yes, he is. Papa's 20. Rand held up 10 fingers, then 10 again, before continuing. "Uncle Myron's 14. The boy flashed up 10 fingers, then folded 6 of them out of sight. "And I'm 4. Rand ended his demonstration by waggling his 4 remaining digits. "You can't be 4. My son was your height when he was twice your age." Gray shook his head at Rand. "Kid, it isn't bloody likely you're his son." "No, Papa was 16 when I was born," Rand corrected. To further clarify his point, he held up 10 fingers, and then 6. "How do you know that?" Sarn stared at his son in shock. Myron had promised to teach Rand to add and subtract, but those lessons had stalled at 1 + 1 = 2. "People talk, and I listen," Rand shrugged. Embarrassed, Sarn shook his head. His son soaked up everything around him, just like a sponge. He had to watch what he said from now on. However, the exchange set the men off again, and their laughter echoed off the walls. As he wiped tears of mirth from his eyes, Gray directed his next question to Sarn. "Is the boy Beku's son?" "Yes, she's my mama." Rand's face crumpled, and he leaned into Sarn. "But she went away and didn't come back. Do you know where she went?" Rand glanced at the men with hope. His grief pinned all 5 men in place. Sarn shifted so he could hug his son. "You still have your uncle and me. We'll always be there for you." Rand nodded and sniffed. "I know." The boy transferred his hopeful gaze to his father. "Can we go see Mama someday?" Sarn kept the "no" building in his soul, caged behind his teeth. Rand was his son now. Beku had given up all rights to the boy when she disappeared. Anger tightened a noose around Sarn's neck, choking off any further words. Death would be too pat an end to the whole Chaudhry affair. No, Beku was out there somewhere, and he refused to search for her. Sarn held his son close to his heart and let the question hang between them, unanswered. Gray extended a hand to Sarn, but not a truce, since the men had yet to claim their pound of flesh. Sarn ignored the hand and stood up on his own. Once he was vertical, his son looked up at him with a plea in his green eyes, and his thin arms rose for a pickup. Sarn scooped up his son, and Rand curled into his chest. "How did you know my name? I've never seen any of you before," Sarn asked, cutting right to the heart of his confusion. He backed up until a 5-foot wall of undamaged boxes separated him from the 5 men, but he could still see them over it. His heel struck 2 metal balls, sending them rolling. Sarn glanced at the floor to check for more trip hazards until the question that had gnawed at him dragged his attention back to Gray. "How did Beku die?" Gray's accusatory eyes narrowed on Sarn. "I told you already. I don't know. I wasn't there." Sarn rubbed slow circles on his son's back. Rand deserved a little coddling after the morning they'd had. "Liar!" Tree stumps for legs pointed an accusing finger at Sarn. I can't lie. The thing lighting up my eyes won't let me. Sarn gestured with his free hand, and all eyes riveted on his fate's damned face until Rand turned in his embrace to face them. Gray and his friend's stares bounced between Sarn and his son, taking in their uncanny resemblance. Rand smiled, loving their response. Tension thrummed through Sarn, stretching his spine rigid as a pole. He hated when people stared at him, but Rand kept pushing his hood back when Sarn tried to pull it down to cover his face. He finally succeeded when his son's attention drifted to the destruction they caused. Sarn relaxed when shadows veiled most of his scarred face. Tree stumps for limbs drew himself up to his full height, an impressive 5'11" to Sarn's 6.5 feet. Liar! She wouldn't leave the lower quarters without you. Yeah, well, on that cold day she did. Sarn struggled to cover his son's ears. They'd perked up at the mention of his mother. Ironically, he'd been planning to leave her and take Rand with him again, but she'd disappeared before he could say anything. Nor could he stop the jealousy from flaring up, even though Beku's whereabouts were no longer his concern. Neither was the identity of the person she had stepped out with on that fateful morning. She'd made her choice. Sarn shook his head. It wasn't me. I know, Rand said, speaking for the first time since the subject of his mother had come up. You were sleeping. I was too. Yeah, I was your mattress. Sarn poked his son in the belly, making the boy squirm. Then he refocused on Gray and company to see what effect Rand's statement had on them. Why did you think I had something to do with it? Gray folded his arms over his chest. 4 years ago, I stopped by to say hello and to check on the current crop of foundlings. I found the place all but abandoned. A few stragglers told me a shocking story about a picnic. Sarn recalled the June Sunday in question. Butterflies had flitted through the flowers, and a 3-month-old Rand had batted tiny fists at them. Sarn marveled at how much his son had grown since then, and he wondered if his relationship with Rand's mother had been toxic then, too. What does an outing 4 years ago have to do with this? Gray ignored the question. Imagine my surprise to find out Beku had gone to this picnic on the arm of her newest boy toy. Beku, the woman who hadn't gone outside in 2 decades, but she went outside with you. 2 decades, Sarn repeated, staggered by the implications. He'd known Beku was a shut-in, but how could she stay underground for so long without going crazy? A bunch of things tumbled together to form an ugly whole. Do you know what agoraphobia means? Sarn shook his head. Fear of wide-open spaces. Gray paused and debated something. Agoraphobia? Rand repeated, breaking the word up into its composite syllables. Fear of wide-open spaces. What are wide-open spaces? The meadow is one. Sarn held his son tighter. Rand repeated the word. Mama had this agoraphobia? Yes, according to Gray she did, and Sarn saw it now in hindsight. Rand's face clouded again, portending more questions. Am I sick with agoraphobia? No, you don't have any phobias. Sarn rubbed his son's back again. It is a sickness, Gray interrupted. It is? Sarn and his son asked in unison. Gray's comment wrapped an icy dread around Sarn, and its grip tightened with every word the man said. It's a disease of the mind where the fear lives. It makes its den in awful memories and feeds off them until there's nothing left. Rand shivered at the vivid description, as anxious eyes fixed on Sarn again. Did the phobia kill Mama? Rand uttered the word kill as if he knew what it meant. Oh, I think it did, Gray said before Sarn could answer. His gaze skimmed over Sarn's body, scanning him from head to toe. Sarn returned the glare with interest as his cloak drew together, blocking Gray's assessing stare. Rand wriggled until he could see out. His heel encountered a solid object, the wall. The fight had moved into a storeroom, and Gray and company blocked the only exit. Damn. Panic surged through Sarn until he hammered it down with logic. With a little ingenuity, anything was possible, especially if he added a dash of magic to it. Rand patted his pockets, causing the metal balls inside them to clink and the Y-shaped top of his slingshot to pop out. At least they had one weapon to hand. No wonder she liked you. She'd found someone as screwed up in here as she was. Gray pointed to his head and relaxed. He'd cracked a tough nut and exposed its meat, leaving Sarn vulnerable and hating it. What do you want? I want to know what happened. She was very close to you. Closer than she'd been with any of her previous lovers. You knew her better than anyone else, even though you were half her age. And I keep telling you, I don't know what happened to her. Sarn heard the chiming of bells, but he ignored them since he had until 20th bell to meet the Rangers, somewhere. They were the least of his concerns. Who are you people, and why do you care? You don't know who we are? Gray exchanged startled glances with his compatriots. No. Well, since we know your name and your boys, I suppose introductions are in order. Dirk was the one Sarn had tagged as Gray. His companions included Ragnes, Villar, Chriso, and Gorfen. None of their names registered. How do you know Beku? She didn't mention us? Villar looked put out as he threaded his belt through the loops on his pants. I'd remember if she had. Would he? Sarn suppressed his doubts. Now wasn't the time to entertain them. Interesting. Well, if you're the jealous type, I doubt she would have. Ragnes took pleasure in delivering such a low blow. Great, they were old lovers. Sarn ground his teeth. Should he expect more of Beku's old flames to show up and threaten him? His life offered enough complications without that. We grew up with her. We were all foundlings at one time, Dirk said, taking pity on Sarn. We're not old lovers, though some of us might have wanted to be. You know why it wouldn't have been possible. The man's phrasing threw Sarn for a loop, and he rubbed his temples with his free hand. What the hell was Dirk implying? Dirk blew out an impatient breath. You're not real bright, are you? I don't know much about Beku's life before I met her, Sarn snapped. Of course he'd never asked because he hadn't wanted to field the reverse questions. Oh! Dirk's face softened in understanding. So you didn't know some jerk raped her when she was young? Afterwards, she feared grown men, so she went after teenage boys. She told me about that. Rand shifted so his head fit the hollow between his neck and shoulder. His breath warmed the fabric, bumping over Sarn's collarbone. What's rape mean? I'll explain later. Sarn would, too, even if the explanation dredged up memories of an incident he'd failed to prevent. The lower quarters teemed with users, abusers, the indifferent, and some of them liked little boys. Rand needed to know what to do and how to get help. I'm hungry, Rand whispered in his ear. I know, and I'll get something for you as soon as we get out of here. And Sarn still had to deal with all the strangeness of yesterday and this morning, but later, after food cleared away the mental cobwebs. I know. I didn't want you to forget. As if his son would let him forget. Sarn shook his head at his son's lack of faith in him, then stilled. Echoes bounced off the naked stone in the corridor outside the storeroom. 2 sets of footsteps approached, and so did the complaints of men who never ventured below ground. Voices he knew well. Their symbols ignited on the map his magic had constructed during the fight, and Sarn bit off a curse. Why did it have to be them? And that is the end of chapter 20, which is the first chapter in part 2 of Curse Breaker Enchanted. And I'm sorry if some of the fight scene was a bit confusing. I'm not good at writing fight scenes. I lost count of how many YouTube videos of fights that I watched when I was trying to choreograph this, and I have a hard time visualizing fights. So I did the best I could with it, and I apologize if the beginning part of it was a bit confusing. I'm trying to figure out how to script it better, but it's just not a skill that I possess. So hopefully someday I'll find somebody who can help me with that, because I would really love to get that fight scene to be not as chaotic and difficult to follow. I've tried several times, but I just have a hard time visualizing it. So it is what it is. And Sarn doesn't really help with that because he doesn't like fighting. He will fight if attacked, as you saw in this scene, but if there's any way to avoid a fight, that's the road that he will take. He's more a man of peace than of violence. In this book, in Curse Breaker Enchanted, he's angry, he's very depressed, he has a very low opinion of himself, but that changes as the Curse Breaker series goes along, and he's not trying to fit himself anymore into the role that he's decided that he needs to play, and accepted who he is and his magic, and that it's okay to not be a fighter. It's okay to be a man of peace, to be someone who would prefer to shield people than to fight them. So that's an evolution that he goes through on his journey through the series, because he is more of a warm and loving person, and violence is difficult for him, as you saw in the fight. Like, he's not actually very good at it. He gets distracted, more concerned with other people than in his own safety, or in really winning the fight, or fighting back, which is how the fight ended so quickly. He's just not really a fighter. And I forgot how long this chapter was, so I was trying to read it without my voice giving out, so hopefully it stayed strong throughout the entire chapter. There's a few things that came up in this chapter that I just want to briefly mention. One of them is the cancer that Sarn sensed within the mountain, and that we deal with directly starting in Curse Breaker Faceted, Curse Breaker Falls, Curse Breaker Sundered, and it's finally cleared up in Curse Breaker Hidden. And Curse Breaker Hidden is one of my favorite Curse Breaker books. One of the best books that I have written. It is the pinnacle. It really is like a mountaintop experience in that book. And it's not just Sarn. Many people have mountaintop experiences in that book. I love that book. It's just phenomenal. So that's where you'll get more about that. And Rand's mother, Beku, you will get more of her in, I'm not sure exactly which book. There's a scene in the book that I'm writing now, which was supposed to be a short story, but I think Rand miscategorized it. I don't think it's a Christmas story. I don't think it's a short story. I'm pretty sure this is going to be a regular length novel. And I understand why he didn't tell me that it would be, because I thought it would be something short and fun. Because the end of book 9, which was Curse Breaker Revealed, which came out last September, there was a lot of questions about, what was going to happen next. Would Sarn be able to keep custody of his son? And so we wanted to have just something showing the adjustment and how things are proceeding after that point, after Rand was revealed to certain key characters who did not know that he existed before that. And so that's what's going on in the book Shards for His Gift, which was supposed to be a shorter work, but it is becoming a full novel. I have 24 chapters written. I had planned to write chapter 25 today, but unfortunately, I spent most of the day at the hospital with my father. I got a call from my brother that they were rushing him to the ER early this morning, and I ran over to the hospital, and I've been there most of the day. And I was planning to record this chapter today. So when I got home from the hospital, I grabbed a glass of water and sat down and read it. I thought it would be just a great way to unwind, and because I love Curse Breaker Enchanted. It started everything, and I love Sarn and his son. I love all the characters in it. So it was really nice to spend a little bit of time with them in their first book. So I hope that you enjoyed it. I'm also supposed to be writing Rogue Rescue, which is book 4 of the Robin of Larkspur series. I have not released Rogue Ranger, which is book 3 of her series, but it is finished. I am going to be putting it up on pre-order. I was going to sort that out between today and this weekend, but I don't think I'm going to be able to do that because I'm going to be at the hospital tomorrow and Saturday and probably Sunday. And then Monday I will be up to the office, and I don't tend to get much done Monday, Tuesday, or Wednesday because I get home so late from commuting to the office. And so my goal is still to get Shards for His Gift, which is going to be now the 10th book in the Curse Breaker series. Curse Breaker Joust will be, I guess, book 11. It was supposed to be book 10, but the characters decided that they would rather it be book 11 than we do something else in between. So who am I to argue? It's not like I win any arguments with them. And I also plan to get Robin's 3rd, 4th, and 5th book out. Now it looks like there's going to be a 6th book. We'll talk more about the upcoming books and things in the next chapter because, depending on what goes on with my dad, that may affect the publication schedule and my writing time. So I don't want to get too far ahead in here because I'm not sure what sort of care he'll need when he comes out of the hospital, or how long he'll be there, and if I'm going to be going there next week as well. There's so many questions and they just don't have answers to. So I don't want to get too far ahead. I don't want to promise things and not be able to deliver them. So if you enjoyed Curse Breaker Enchanted, it is available as an ebook, a paperback, a hardcover. There is an audiobook version that's narrated by a digital voice. It's one of Google's voices, and that's free on Google Play. I've also got it up on my YouTube channel, so if you want to hear it with a no pressure situation, you can do that. And I'll have all the links in the description. Also, lots of sequels. And if you want to support what I'm doing here or help defray the cost of editing and covers and things, you can join my Patreon or my Substack. I'll have those links as well. And if you do join either of those, you can read chapters as I finish them. You'll also get a copy of the ebook version of every book that I write, as long as you're a part of the Patreon. Yeah, and I hope to see you back, hopefully next week. We'll see what's going on with my dad, but I'm going to try and do these weekly. So have a great day or evening wherever you are. And again, I'm Melinda Kucsera. I'm an independent fantasy author, and I'm bringing you magical mayhem weekly. Thanks for listening to me ramble.